Well, if San Jacinto is one of the most important battles in American history, we're lucky to have as our next speaker the guy who knows more about the Battle of San Jacinto than any person I've ever met. The founder of this conservancy and the founder of this symposium, Jeff Dunn. As a practicing attorney, of course, Jeff is a multitasker. I know he's a multitasker because over the past few years I've shared many hotel rooms with Jeff. The most recent one, he was reading me his next day's speech at 1 o'clock in the morning as I was trying to put this third pillow over my head. And the next day, after he gave his very good speech, I said, good job, Jeff. And he said, you didn't say that last night. And I said, well, I was going to sleep last night. But besides, you changed it. You added some stuff and made it better. He said, yeah, that was at 3 o'clock in the morning. Jeff is well known to all of you because of his activity in this organization. And I'm not going to take any more of his precious time because he has 12,813 slides. That may be a slight exaggeration, that he's about to show you as he explains the details of this sacred ground, the battleground at San Jacinto, what brought it all about, and how it happened, and what it stands for today, and how it stands today. Jeff.
Thank you, Jim. Well, good morning. On the night of April 21st, 1836, we had about 1,000 men camping on Buffalo Bayou, about 20 miles east of downtown Houston. And they probably could not have imagined the repercussions of what had happened just a few hours earlier. Those repercussions at this engagement that came to be known as the Battle of San Jacinto were felt from Mexico City all the way to Washington, D.C. And in addition to that, and because of that event, the place where this event happened suddenly became transformed forever into a historic site and into a place that became very symbolic of Texas independence and also Texas as a nation state. And that's the story I'm going to talk about today, is the battlefield, the story of the battlefield, which is a lot different from the story of the battle itself. Now, where is this place located? The battlefield is located in East Harris County, and it took place on the Arthur McCormick League, which was a grant of land awarded by the Mexican government in 1824. Here is a shot of the overhead showing where the battlefield is located in East Harris County. You're going to see a lot of this map. This map is Henderson Yoakum's, from Henderson Yoakum's History of Texas, 1856. It is considered the best early map of the battlefield because it not only is reasonably accurate in terms of its the dimensions, but also it depicts the lines of the armies and shows how the battle was fought. Now, I'm not going to belabor too much about the battle, but I think I need to go through the sequence of events very quickly. The first soldiers that arrived at the battlefield were Mexican soldiers, Mexican cavalry under Colonel Juan Almonte, April 16th. He arrived at Lynch's Ferry, could not cross, he backtracked and took the road to New Washington, and that's where Santa Anna ended up on April 18th. 4 days later, on April 20th, Houston's army approaches. He knows that Santa Anna wants to cross the San Jacinto River at Lynch's Ferry. That becomes the tactical point where both armies are converging. He arrives there first on the morning of April 20th and captures a Mexican flatboat. The first hostilities break out between the two armies. Later that morning, Houston backtracks along a place along Buffalo Bayou where there are trees for shelter, and here comes Santa Anna's army. And during the morning and early afternoon, they bombard each other with cannon and musket fire and rifle fire. Later that evening, Santa Anna retires to a place beyond the other side of what's now the San Jacinto Monument, and there is a cavalry fight that evening, which didn't really result in anything decisive. The next morning, April 21st, Santa Anna receives reinforcements from General Koss, which increases the size of his army. Now he has a numerical advantage over Sam Houston. On the first day, Sam Houston actually had more men than Santa Anna did. And it was that afternoon, April 21st, when the Texans marched across the prairie, separating the two armies, attacked the Mexican army, and within about 30 minutes overwhelmed the Mexican army. And for the next 2 hours, you have a scene where there is basically indiscriminate slaughter of Mexican soldiers before they're eventually able to surrender by Colonel Buonamonte at dusk. And they return back to the Texan Army camp, and the battle is over with. Now, when you think about the Battle of San Jacinto, you have the man-made features that are there today. This map shows the Yoakum. This is the Yoakum map showing the current location of the San Jacinto Monument, Reflection Pool, and the Battleship Texas, which are the major features at the battlefield today. But when you think about the battlefield and how to interpret it, you have to go back to 1836 and think of what are the defining features of that landscape that made the battle occur, and why did it occur the way it did. One of these features is water. You have Buffalo Bayou, you have the San Jacinto River, which the battle was named for, Peggy's Lake in the rear, and a boggy bayou in the back, which impeded the Mexican army retreat. You also have marshes, plenty of marshes in the area. These marshes basically prevented Santa Anna from bypassing Houston's army and reaching Lynch's Ferry, which is where he originally wanted to go. You have trees. These trees were important as shelter. In those days where you had trees out in the prairie, they were called islands of trees. And then you have open prairie. This was also very significant. We didn't have mountains and other kinds of obstacles that you see in many other of the battles in the Civil War. And there are roads. You have the Harrisburg-Lynchburg Road and the road to New Washington. Very important part of the of how the battle unfolded. And finally, you have man-made structures, which there were very few. There was Peggy McCormick's house. There was Lorenzo DeZavala's house, Nathaniel Lynch's house, who ran the ferry. Those places are all gone today. The day after the battle, the 8 soldiers who were killed in the battle were buried in the Texas Army camp. And later that same year, the town of San Jacinto arises along Buffalo Bayou. That town eventually was swept away by hurricanes in the 1870s. So the beginning of the history of the battlefield is really as a place of veneration and ceremony. And one of the most insightful books that I've read about battlefields is by Ed Linenthal, who wrote Sacred Ground, Americans and Their Battlefields. And he talks about how American battlefields go through 3 phases. The first phase is one of veneration. The second phase is one of defilement, where the battlefield's covered up with markers and other things. And the third phase is redefinition, how people reflect and define and reconsider what has happened in the past in terms of interpreting the site. And that's very similar to what's happened with the San Jacinto battlefield. From the very beginning, you read and see how people refer to this place as sacred ground, hallowed ground. And Americans are not typically accustomed to calling places sacred or hallowed. Usually you think of those as very religious places, maybe in the Middle East or someplace like that, but Americans don't usually do that. But in the case of our battlefields, it's fairly common. You often see Gettysburg, for example, called hallowed ground. And of course, Lincoln, when he gave his address there, talked about it, hallowed ground, and how it was consecrated. Same thing with San Jacinto. One of the first, in fact, one of the very first evidences that I've been able to find of how the battlefield was venerated is an account by Colonel Pedro Delgado, who was one of the Mexican soldiers who was captured at the battle. And he was being transported on May 8th, just a few weeks after the battle, to Galveston, along with other Mexican soldiers, kept a wonderful diary. And in there he says that very early on May 8th, after striking the bell 3 times, the steamboat Yellowstone, which was what he was on, was set in motion, and we glided down to Galveston. Not to forget it, I mentioned a strange incident. As the steamboat passed opposite the battlefield of San Jacinto, the troops on board were formed, facing to the field, and presented arms, the drums beating a march. They remained in that position until they had lost sight of the field. And then he says, what was their object? He wasn't clear, but it seems clear to me that what was happening was these soldiers were saying, we are now passing a very special place that we made special by what happened and by the fact that the remains of our 8 buddies are still out there, and, and that what they've achieved was something of great significance. In 1837, Juan Seguin, when he was at the Alamo taking care of the ashes, talked about the Alamo being hallowed ground. The same year, Mississippi Senator R.J. Walker spoke to the Congress of Texas and said, I've trod upon the battlefield of San Jacinto, that consecrated ground where valor and liberty triumphed. The very next year, Gustav Dressel, a visitor to Texas, was on a steamboat from Houston to Galveston. And of course, the battlefield is very conveniently located right on the steamboat route. And he said that there were veterans on board that steamboat. And he wrote that as the veterans now saw the sacred ground, as Dressel wrote, their liberty-loving hearts beat faster, and they described their former fight with fiery vividness. So these are the kinds of things that were going on. You see in these early maps of Texas, like this particular one is very interesting. It shows a flag in San Jacinto, 1836, very prominently displayed on it. In 1839, Frederick Guillardet, who was a Frenchman who was visiting Houston at the time, left a very vivid account. He happened to be in Houston on April 21st, 1839, and went on a steamboat to the Battleground at midnight to observe how the Texans were going to commemorate this battle. And he wrote that it was midnight when the steamboat reached the plain known to the Texans as the Battleground. No sooner had we arrived at this scene of recent glory and importance for Texans than the passengers who filled the steamer to capacity broke forth into frenzied shouting, mingled with artillery fire and military band music. It was a curious spectacle to witness, this really terrifying explosion of patriotic enthusiasm. Soon we all went ashore, and the patriotic throng, armed with rosin torches, formed a fiery frame around the field. There the famous patriotic song, Yankee Doodle, was sung. And the ceremony concluded with 3 cheers, honoring the memory of their heroes who had died for their country. But despite this, it wasn't until 20 years after the battle, 1856, when a ceremony on the battlefield, conducted by Francis R. Lubbock, who became governor, decided, you know, we need to have a monument out here. We need to have something to mark this site. So he started what was called the San Jacinto Monumental Association. And the idea was to raise money to do this. And he actually got $1,000 out of the Texas legislature that same year to help, in their words, aid in enclosing the graves of the soldiers and building a monument. And Lubbock was an interesting character. Of course, he played a very significant role in Texas history. And at one point, he spoke to a group of veterans and said he always regretted that he came to Texas in 1836, just after the battle. And he said that if I had known how few of you would have been killed, I would have most certainly been there. In 1857, a traveler who went around the West and did drawings actually came to the battlefield, and we see the first 2 drawings of the battlefield that we know of that exist, that are accurately depicted, and we see these interesting scenes. And in 1860, Sam Houston, who was, of course, a very prominent political figure as a result of his role at the battle, decided he wanted to run for president of the United States. And he got together a group of his friends, and they decided to nominate him on the battlefield on April 21st, 1860. And one interesting thing that happened is a number of newspapers who were not particularly happy with Union sentiment criticized this rally. In particular, and they did so not because the rally was being held, but because it was being held on that date at that place. And in particular, I want to read this one editorial that appeared in a Houston newspaper. It said, "It was to be hoped that the battlefield upon which the valor of Texans won the blessings of liberty might remain disconnected from political maneuvers and occupy a position to which all, regardless of party, might look with unmingled feelings of just and patriotic pride. But it seems that the sanctity of the place and its glorious historical associations was not to escape a ruthless laying on of violent hands by the intense admirers and unbounded political worshipers of Sam Houston. They have dragged it into the political arena for political effect, and upon them rest whatever irreverent feeling may be engendered by their course." But despite this criticism, the rally was held, and it was actually presided over by Isaac Hill, a veteran of the battle, and they actually passed resolutions in support of the Union. And of course, Sam Houston was not nominated for president, did not become president. Instead, we ended up with the Civil War, and during the midst of the Civil War, there was a battle in Galveston, and a number of cotton-clad boats floated down from Houston to Galveston. They passed the San Jacinto battlefield, and in fact, the battlefield, in particular the town of San Jacinto, had a Confederate gun ordnance facility and a naval shipyard. So the actual site of the battlefield also played a minor role in the Civil War. After the war, you continue to see commemorations at the battlefield. This is an advertisement from 1870 where boats would be leaving from both Galveston and Houston and converging on the battlefield. In 1874, the Texas legislature adopts a law that creates the first two state holidays. They were April 21st, San Jacinto Day, and March 2nd, Texas Independence Day. Those are the first two state holidays, 1874. In 1882, 46 years after the battle, a monument is finally erected. It was not erected through Lubbock's money. It was erected by a judge from Richmond, Texas, Judge Sullivan, who, through himself and through subscriptions raised in Galveston, they were appalled when they visited the battlefield to see the unkempt condition of the place. They felt that the heroes of the battle needed to be commemorated. They raised the money and they built this wonderful monument, which still exists at the place. It was built, the only grave that was still recognized was that of Benjamin Brigham, so they put the marker directly over his grave, and today it's called the Brigham Monument. This is it's a beautiful monument. It's really one of the most underrated structures at the site. Here's a close-up shot of it. It is made out of Vermont marble, and it's about 15 and a half feet high. Now, this began the next phase of the history of the battlefield, and that was one of trying to save it for posterity. The first thing that happened was after that monument was built, the legislature appropriated $1,500 to actually purchase the cemetery where the graves were. And this occurred in 1883. It was a 10-acre tract. And the same law, the same statute, appropriated $20,000 to purchase the Alamo Chapel, $1,500 to purchase the graves of the men at Goliad, and $1,000 to purchase the graves of the Dawson heroes from the 1840s. So we see the state of Texas taking baby steps into this notion of historic preservation. In 1890, the Texas Press Association announced that they were in favor of purchasing the entire battlefield. And the leading force for that was this Judge A.B. Norton, who actually lived in Dallas. He knew Sam Houston personally. He was also a Unionist during the Civil War. He was from Ohio. And the reason his hair and beard is so long is because when he lived in Ohio in 1844, he vowed that he would never cut his hair or beard until Henry Clay was elected president. But he was not a very good organizer. He's formed the Sam Houston Monumental Association. Was not a good organizer, and it really took another organization to kind of lead the way. And that organization turned out to be the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, which was organized the following year. And 3 days after the main organization was formed, the San Jacinto chapter, which was DRT number 2, was organized. And that was the entity that took it upon themselves to try to do something with the battlefield. Now, this organization still exists today, but it was quite different at that time, because at that time you had actual wives, widows, and real daughters of these veterans. They knew these people. They wanted to honor their husbands and fathers, and so they had a very large personal stake in the outcome of what was going to happen, because they knew that as time was going on, these veterans were passing on, and they were a little concerned, I think, that posterity would somehow forget what they did. 1893, the first bill was presented to the legislature. Governor Hogg became the first governor to endorse purchasing the battlefield. In that year, a bill was introduced to seek $75,000 to purchase the field. The legislature awarded $15,000. Governor Hogg cut it down to $750. It was approved, but the $750 was never appropriated. So even though Hogg favored it, he managed somehow to not make it come into effect. And incidentally, in November of 1893, Governor Hogg did visit the Battleground, and an interesting incident of that visit was that while there he saw an owl in a tree, and he just instinctively took his gun and shot and killed the owl. The next year, 1894, the San Jacinto chapter of the DRT said, you know, what we really need to do is try to figure out where this battlefield is. So they escorted 9 surviving veterans to the battlefield on July 4th of that year to try to locate and define which of the tracks needed to be purchased. They wanted to be a little bit more specific going back before they went back to the legislature that following year. They did so, and in 1897, the DRT returns to the legislature. This year, they want $25,000. They want to buy 250 acres. They know exactly what tracts they want. They want 3 commissioners appointed to purchase these tracts. And they did something very interesting as part of their strategy. They sponsored a trip for the governor and the legislature to the Battleground, which was done in February of 1897, so they could see the site. And of course, it was a wonderful trip. Everybody had a good time. At least one representative, though, thought the whole trip was scandalous. He later wrote that they consumed 21 kegs of beer in 3 hours, and we had every other kind of drinks known to Texas civilization. So I'm not sure exactly what those daughters did, but in any event, during that legislative session, they did get a bill passed, but there was a lot of debate over the bill. And after the bill passed, there was some protest saying, hey, this is a little bit too expensive. We're going through a little depression at this point. We've got some deficits. And the real question was, what is Culberson going to do? And he ended up vetoing the bill. And that was a big setback. But if you notice at the bottom of this newspaper article, it says, deficits staring Texas in the face. He was worried about the deficits. Sound familiar? They were going through that too in the 1890s. But it came back again. The bill came back again. It was reduced from $25,000 to $10,000. That did pass. And so you finally had, for the first time, some appropriation to purchase the battlefield. And Culberson appointed the 3 individuals for commissioners. S.J. Hendrick, who was the grandson of Allen Vince, Waller T. Burns, who was the Houston senator who shepherded the bill through, and James M. Hill, the veteran, who was actual veteran of the battle, were the 3 commissioners assigned to go out and purchase this battlefield. They met later in 1897 and started work, and they soon decided that the appropriation, which only permitted them to buy at $25 an acre, not anymore, was not going to be enough because there were a couple of holdout tracts. In fact, when the appraisers came back, they said that the Havermill tract in particular, which was the middle ground, was worth $37.50. They couldn't buy it. At that point, all the negotiations stopped. The San Jacinto chapter came out with a press release, so to speak, saying, hey, we're going to give up this. We can't do this anymore. We've already tried it for several years, and we're worried now that because Buffalo Bayou is getting ready to be widened, the land prices are going to go up even more. But lo and behold, things turned fairly quickly, and toward the end of the year, a couple of owners did agree to sell their tracts. And you see that the old graveyard tract shown on this overhead, purchased in 1883, John W. Campbell sold his tract, which was 67 acres, later that year in 1898, and the Wilson and Willard tract sold also in December of 1898. And the following year, the Hiram Rogers, which had to go to condemnation, that was also, the appraisers came in at 135, with 135 acres at $20 per acre. But the real problem was that center tract, where you see where the monument is, which was the Havermill tract. So they had to go back to the legislature. And they did so in 1899. And at that time, Sayers, Governor Sayers, was in charge, and a bill was passed, and he signed it. And basically the bill authorized these commissioners to purchase the Havermill tract, which they did in April of 1900, and we're beginning to see the bringing together of the original portion of what they originally viewed as the battlefield. The problem was there was a little tract of about 15 acres right on the waterfront, which is a very critical tract. It was owned by a Northern syndicate, and one of the leaders of the DRT, San Jacinto chapter, was Mayfin McKeever, who is the Jan DeVault of the 19th century, frankly. And she was bothered because every time she went out there, this Northern syndicate was sort of like, they were the holdouts. And she saw the sign out there. I don't have a photocopy of the sign, but I have a rendition of it. And basically, the sign said, San Jacinto Battleground lots for sale in Chicago. So she was really worried about it and wanted to try to save that particular property. But she couldn't get it at that point. 1901 comes along. James Washington Winters is the only surviving veteran that they could find who could make the trip out to the battlefield. And they took him out there because they wanted him to pinpoint various sites associated with the battle. He was 84 years old at the time. He identified 16 sites. They put galvanized iron crosses, places where Burleson camped, where Sherman camped, where the marches were, where Santa Anna's camp was. And that's how that was the beginning of the marking of the battlefield. And here's an advertisement identifying what was going on. Now, but in 1901, after they had bought those tracts, reports were coming out, you know, the state's not really taking care of it. I mean, it's one thing to buy the tracts, it's another thing to try to maintain it and so forth. Reports were coming in that the grounds were neglected, the trees were being mutilated by campers, the graves were being desecrated. Something had to be done. The daughters actually went out there and cleaned the place themselves for a while. Here's an interesting postcard showing a woman on what looks like a lawnmower pulled by two horses. So they had to go back to the legislature, and they did so in 1903. They asked for $25,000 for a fence. They got $10,000 from the legislature. Governor Lanham reduced it to $1,000, and then he vetoed the bill. So they had to go back again. And this time they went back in 1907, and this time they really did make another big push. This was another big year for them. They took the legislature back out to the battleground again. That was very important. This bill asked for $25,000. They wanted to use this money to buy the 15-acre tract. They wanted to create a state park out of it. They wanted 3 commissioners appointed to operate the state park and build a keeper's cottage there. And they actually passed that bill, and Governor Campbell signed it. And so in 1907, this is wrong, it says 1897, it should be 1907, the first state park in Texas was created, and that was the San Jacinto State Park. It was overseen by the Superintendent of Public Buildings and Grounds, who at that time was W.C. Day, and he later became Superintendent of San Jacinto. The Superintendent of Public Grounds later became the State Board of Control, and the legislation called for 3 park commissioners. The first 3 were Rosine Ryan, who was a daughter, and actually a daughter of Adolphus Stern of Nacogdoches, and also Sam Ash and Joe Rice were the 3 commissioners. They took the money, and they were able to buy the 15-acre Northern Syndicate tract. They started publicizing what they viewed as the beautification of the site to create it into a park. And a news reporter that went out there talked to the commissioners, and he said that the idea here was not to change any more than possible the original aspect of the battlefield. The landscape will be altered as little as possible. Nothing will be permitted that is not in keeping with the patriotic idea of preserving the battlefield. Now here's a map from this is a later map, but it's a land grant map, and it shows the outline of the tracts that were purchased. And on this map, I've superimposed it. It's inverted because the Yoka map is facing a different direction. But it shows that the tracts that they bought did in fact, to the extent this map is accurate, did in fact cover a lot of the battle activities, but not all of them. In 1909, back to the legislature, the commissioner said, we need a fence, we need an artesian well, we need boat landings, we need to mark the battle sites, we need $15,000 a year for 2 years. The legislature said, yes, that's fine, and Campbell vetoed it. But they still had money left from the 1907 bill. And with that money, they were able to build a few structures. And on April 21st, 1910, the park officially opens with a big ceremony at the time. You have the boat landing was built. Here's another shot of it. I'm going to go through these quickly because Jim is right. I got about 1,000 slides here. They built a flag staff, 75 feet high. This is all along the waterfront. This is a scene from that actual day. This is a gate which was donated by the Hardware Jobbers Association of Fort Worth. It says San Jacinto Battlefield on the gates. At the ceremony were 2 veterans of the battle, W.P. Zuber and Alfonso Steele. Zuber was with the camp guard, so he was not actually in the battle, but got there the next day. Steele was actually wounded in the battle severely and managed to outlive all of his comrades. Here they are raising the flag. This was the last day, the last time that any veterans of the battle ever stepped foot on the battlefield, April 21st, 1910. 2 years later, the San Jacinto chapter of the Daughters starts putting up boulders to replace those galvanized iron pipes. And to this day, these boulders remain out there. Many of them do. Some have been moved. A few of them have been missed. But to this day, these boulders remain the only historical interpretation of the battlefield if you're walking the ground out there. They're very historic, but they only give you a little snippet of what was going on at the time. Here's a nice overhead view of the Texas Army camp. They were still arriving by boat in the 1920s. Here's a map of the battlefield from the 1920s. San Jacinto Inn. Many of you probably remember this. My mouth still waters when I think of it. Basically, it opened in 1927. It was really the only private institution. You know, a lot of battlefields would have a lot of these tacky tourist stuff or things come up to greet people, but this particular restaurant was the only private business anywhere near the battlefield. And of course, as many of you know, it was a great restaurant, very much of an institution in Houston for many years. So now that brings us up to the 1930s. And when you have a site like this, and especially now you're coming up to the centennial of the battle, it's very tempting to use the site as a platform to build great monuments. But before even that happened, even before the San Jacinto Monument was built, there were a number of projects dealing with the battlefield that never materialized. One was in 1912, there was a proposal to build a state fish hatchery on the battlefield. And the only reason that didn't pan out was because there wasn't enough fresh water for it. In 1916, there was a proposal for a playground and pleasure resort, and that project was killed by the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, who wrote a letter condemning it as a desecration of Texas soil made sacred by the blood of Texas heroes. In 1927, there was a proposal to build a military cemetery of the Republic of Texas. They were going to bring 900 graves around the state to San Jacinto Battleground. In 1945, Congressman Albert Thomas thought it would be a great idea to bring 300 Liberty ships at Peggy's Lake and just store them there. And in 1953, there was actually a proposal to build a World's Fair right adjacent to the battlefield. A group bought up over 500 acres to do that. None of these panned out, but In March of 1936, there was an announcement, $1 million appropriated to build a shaft to San Jacinto's heroes. There was always talk about building a monument that would pierce the clouds to commemorate the heroes who died. But it really took somebody like Jesse Jones, who was a Houston icon at the time, to really make it happen. He was able to get federal money during the WPA period. The state of Texas chipped in some money, and Jones actually raised some private money to help make it work. And on March 27, 1936, here he is on the right, and Andrew Jackson Houston, Sam Houston's son, on the left, on the groundbreaking ceremony for what at that time was called the San Jacinto Memorial Tower, and what we know today is of course, the San Jacinto Monument. And originally, one of the early proposals had a figure of a pioneer standing on the top of the monument. This is what it would have looked like. But we know, of course, that they ended up with a three-dimensional star. It was a big event, April 21st, 1936, the centennial celebration. The monument was still under construction at the time. In 1936, the Masons built this monument in the Texas Army camp. Julian Munch, who was a famous Houston artist at the time, was horrified by this monument, incidentally. He called it a zoological freak because it combined Corinthian style with other kinds of styles, and didn't particularly like the figure of the man on the top. But nonetheless, it was dedicated, and that monument is still there today. 1939, the monument and its accompanying reflection pool is completed. Here's a shot of the reflection pool looking toward the Buffalo Bayou. And of course, we have this iconic symbol of San Jacinto, which unfortunately is built right in the middle of the battlefield. Initially, they were planning to build it actually on Buffalo Bayou, right at the water's edge, but they decided that would not be an appropriate place because they felt that the waves from the ship channel might darken the steps, the white steps. So they put it in the middle, which was the highest ground at the site. The problem was they had this big building, but there was no money to put anything inside of it. And by the way, the design and the wording is very interesting, and if you've never studied it, it's really very worthy of seeing it because it's a beautiful building. But they had nothing for inside, and it took a man like George A. Hill, who was an oil man. He was a grandson of James M. Hill, one of the veterans that I mentioned earlier, to put together the notion of a museum. And he was the founder of what's called the San Jacinto Museum of History. And initially it was a state agency, and it eventually evolved into a private association, nonprofit. And interestingly enough, its mission was not to interpret the Battle of San Jacinto. Its mission was to interpret early Texas history. And that was largely a function of his collections and the types of collections that were put in there, and also the fact that in 1936 there really was no Texas History Museum anywhere in Texas. And so this was going to be something unique. They wanted to have something much broader than simply the Battle of San Jacinto. And so he started that, and to this day the nonprofit association still operates that museum inside the monument. In 1940, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas built this bronze armillary sundial out of the funds that Francis Lubbock started in the 1850s. That fund was delivered over to the DRT in 1901, and by 1940, they were able to build this. This was also built on the Texas Army camp. So, how did all this relate to the public? What did the public think about this? There was an interesting article I found from 1941, 2 years after the monument was opened. Visitors to the museum during that period, 938,000. Which is equivalent of 363,600 visitors per year. The total population of Houston at that time, 385,000. It was tremendously successful, very unique place to go. It brought people out there mainly to see the monument, to go up to the top, and to experience this architectural wonder. The next thing we see is in the 1940s, after World War II, Albert Thomas, who came up with the idea of storing the Liberty ships, also spearheaded this effort of trying to save the USS Texas, the battleship Texas. It had seen service in World War I and World War II, D-Day, Iwo Jima. The U.S. Navy was going to scrap it, and he came up with the idea, and he encouraged his friend, Congressman Lyndon Johnson, to help him on this, and that was to create a shrine for the sailors of World War II and to put that ship in his district at San Jacinto Battlefield. And this was started in 1945, and over the next 3 years, the legislature mulled it over. They decided, and they figured that they could do this at San Jacinto because of the enormous popularity of the San Jacinto Monument. They could bring it to San Jacinto and charge an admission fee, and that would help pay for the ship at the same time. So this was done, and on April 21st, 1948, in very elaborate ceremonies, the battleship Texas comes to San Jacinto. Now, what nobody talked about at the time, and I have not seen any evidence of this, is the destruction to the historic integrity of the site that this caused. This overhead shows the berth. The berth was artificially dug out of what is now known to be the 1836 Texas Army camp. And in fact, what it destroyed was Sidney Sherman Regiment's camp, which coincidentally happened to be where the Tejanos, Juan Seguin's men, were camped. But there didn't seem to be any particular concern. In fact, no, I don't even see any reference that anybody even mentioned it as a concern at all. And so you have the ship. The ship was parked right next to the San Jacinto Inn, literally steps from San Jacinto Inn on one side. And on the other side, you have the Masonic Monument, also within steps of the ship. And by the 1950s, very interesting phenomena is going on. This is a road map of Texas from 1956, and it shows a scene of the battlefield. But what's interesting about this road map is the caption. The caption says, Battleship Texas and San Jacinto Monument near Houston. It doesn't say, this is the San Jacinto battlefield. In other words, what's happened is that with the coming of the monument, the reflection pool, and the battleship, those elements have supplanted the battlefield in importance, and also the reason why people would go out there. You don't go out there now to learn about the Battle of San Jacinto, to experience the battle on the ground, which is what the daughters had envisioned in the early 1900s and what the legislature intended in the early 1900s. Instead, you go out there to visit the battleship, the monument, and go to the top and have a nice afternoon. And generations of Houstonians have grown up with that notion. And so as a result of that, that's one of the reasons I think why we don't see interpretation of the battlefield happening during that time. In 1965, park management is transferred border control to Texas Parks and Wildlife. 1983, the Battleship Texas is transferred. Prior to that time, it was operated by Battleship Texas Commission. They were unable to take care of the ship. After a while, the expenses became a little bit too great. And so you see, that what you also see is this growing conflict during this period between manager convenience and the sanctity of the battlefield. How do you deal with this? Well, in many instances, the sanctity of the battlefield gave way. For one thing, the berth of the ship has been widened considerably. And again, no one really thought about the fact that every square foot of that berth is a square foot of the 1836 battlefield that's lost forever. In addition, the battleship parking lot was literally built on top of the San Jacinto Cemetery, the 10 acres that was bought in 1883 to honor the heroes of the battle. Two veterans of the battle who were not killed during the battle but chose to be buried there afterwards have their graves literally on top of the parking lot. One is Freeman Wilkinson. You see the 1936 marker here. He died in 1839, wanted to be buried there, and you see the parking lot right next to his grave. And the other one is William Wood, who commanded the Kentucky Volunteers in Burleson's regiment. He died in 1854. And as you can see on the back of his monument, it says, when I die, my wish is to be buried with my comrades at San Jacinto, and they did. But his grave is on the parking lot now. You also, this is a very interesting, that the town of San Jacinto also had many of its citizens buried. And in this particular instance, this grave took up a parking space. So when the parking lot was built, this person remained in place. They did not move the marker. You also see DeZavala Cemetery. This was a cemetery across the bayou at Zavala's home, but when the bayou was widened for the ship channel, a lot of those graves were lost. and the markers were endangered. So through the efforts of the descendants of the DeZavala family, they brought them across the bayou and put them up at San Jacinto. Well, they put them right in the middle of the Texas Army camp. So it's not a historic cemetery. It's a historic cemetery where it was, but now it's got, you have these markers that are not appropriate for what the Texas Army camp was. In the back of the battlefield, you have a nice picnic area, but there's no sign that tells you that this area where you're having your nice picnic is where hundreds of Mexican soldiers were slaughtered in the 2 hours after the battle was initially started. So you see these incongruities here, and it's not, it's just, I'm not condemning anybody for doing these things, except it's just the way the battlefield evolved over time. We kind of lost sight of the fact that it was a battlefield. Instead, it became a place to go see the battleship Texas and the San Jacinto Monument. In addition, there were other things happening around the battlefield at the time. When these monuments were built in the 30s and 40s, it was a rural area. Houston had not expanded out into East Harris County. The ship channel had not been built up at that time. But beginning in the 50s and 60s, you see an acceleration of industrial encroachment, which became really an external threat to the battlefield. Here's a picture of the monument in 1940, and you can see virtually no development around it. Here's another shot. You can see the monument in the distance. This intersection is of what's now Independence Parkway, used to be Battleground Road, and Highway 225. This is, again, 1940. Now here are the roads today, and all of the white facilities are industrial sites in and around the monument. This is here, I've highlighted these in orange. And you can see it's practically totally surrounding the battlefield and actually coming up to the edges of the battlefield. One particular site, the Oxyvinyl site, which is less than a mile from the San Jacinto Monument, is the largest manufacturer of chlorine in North America. And as a result of that, it's very difficult, if not really a safety issue, for having people camp out. That's why we don't have camping at the site, because these chemical plants could pose a very serious threat. Here is another overhead view of how close these facilities have come to the ship and the monument. We also have pipelines, oil pipelines, plenty of them in the area, including pipelines that have been done very recently. As recently as 2010, pipelines were built in the area. And here's a map showing the green line showing all the pipelines in the vicinity of the battlefield. We also have overhead power lines to service the NRG plant, which is nearby. These are massive power lines. You can see them from just about anywhere on the battlefield. We also have air pollution that comes with the industrial encroachment. And you have water pollution. The dioxins in the water also creates risk and also limits the kinds of recreational activities that you normally would see at a state park. And then also with the use of groundwater in the Houston area, you see a lot of subsidence. And it turned out that the area around the battlefield was particularly hard hit by subsidence. What you're looking at is an area, and I've circled this in red, all of that area was above water level, was ground as recently as the 1960s. And so all of these things, and this led to a construction of a levee in the 1970s, which further changed the topography. And here you see the levee over to the right and the battleship in the distance. Boggy Bayou, which was a very small stream where many Mexicans lost their lives, is now a lagoon. And so, at the time of the battle, it did not look like this at all. So you see, all of these things were happening that were threatening both the way the battlefield was interpreted as well as from the outside. And in the 1990s, an interesting phenomenon was going on. Let's create a master plan to try to deal with how we're going to present this site in the future. And the master plan was spearheaded by Parks and Wildlife, the San Jacinto Museum. And the objective here, at the end of the day, was to let's restore this site to its 1836 appearance as feasible. In other words, we're going to redefine the battlefield as a battlefield and put the focus back on the Battle of San Jacinto, which is the reason why the place exists in the first place as a park. They wanted to help visitors better visualize the battle on the ground. They recognized that, yes, you can read about the Battle of San Jacinto, you can see movies about the Battle of San Jacinto, you can see reenactments, but it's quite a different experience when you're on the ground and you can visualize the topography and understand why Houston and Santa Ana were doing what they were doing. It also enhanced green space, the idea that it would promote environmental benefits, wildlife habitat, which fits perfectly into Parks and Wildlife's mission for our state. Some of the recommendations were fairly radical. Restore marshes and prairies, cover up the reflection pool, consider relocating the battleship Texas, promote archaeology and scholarship to define the outer limits of the battleground, construct a new combined TPWD Visitor Center and Museum off the battleground. All of those things were very bold recommendations. And since then, 1998, there have been some significant successes. One of them is that TPWD, even before the master plan, has started purchasing additional tracks around the original tracks that were bought. So that to the point that today, if you look at this map, the red line represents the tracks that were bought by 1909. The hatch marked tracks are tracks that were either purchased or donated to TPWD since then. So a significant amount of territory now has come under conservation under TPWD. But at the same time, you've got some more endangered areas. And these areas I've highlighted in blue. These are the last remaining sites that could be rehabilitated and are, of course, we know are associated with the battle and could be preserved. Another success was the Battleground Conservancy, our group that we formed in 2002. We first organized as the San Jacinto Battleground Association and then became the Friends of San Jacinto Battleground. What was interesting about this is this was formed by the public members of the San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board. Jan DeVault and myself were members at that time. But it was also the first time a nonprofit entity was ever formed to exclusively focus on the needs of the battlefield. And we did it really with practically no money, and we did it in a way that what we were trying to do was not really, at this point we don't even have any employees, but what we were trying to do was gather together the resources, the historians, the experts on historic preservation, battlefield experts, draw upon these resources, the archaeologists in the Houston area, and try to put together a consortium of nonprofits, foundations, of philanthropy, losing my train of thought here, and to try to put all these together to raise money so we could purchase land and do the things that the battleground needed. One of the things we've done is we've purchased 27 acres, and we're still, of course, in the process of attempting to purchase more. This map shows the yellow tracks or tracks that we're now in purchasing. The white triangle are tracks that were purchased and then donated to TPWD in 2005. In addition, the O'Quinn tract, which is on Buffalo Bayou, this is the 19-acre tract, is a great potential for interpretation of the battle as well as the Civil War events that happened in that area. Another success is archaeology. We have done archaeology work at the site as well as Texas Parks and Wildlife. We even won an award from the Texas Historical Commission in 2009 for our work. Another success is marsh restoration and boardwalks. We were able to garner together resources to build an observation platform and extension of the marsh boardwalk. Here you see a scene of that. Texas Parks and Wildlife, through the U.S. Fisheries Commission, did a phenomenal job restoring a significant amount of marshes in the area. So you can get a feel for what it was like with these Mexican soldiers when they were fleeing the Texas Army. Another success is prairie restoration. This is now in progress. There's a contract between our entity and TPWD to restore 110 acres. This map shows you the prairie restoration area and the marsh restoration area and what is being planned in the immediate future. So, 6 challenges for preservation. I'm going to end with this. Now, these are my own thoughts. I've been working at the battlefield now for over 15 years, And we've had successes, we've had setbacks. Jan went through a lot of these, and I would like to say that a lot of these accomplishments that we did are literally the result of Jan DeVault. She's worked tirelessly, unpaid, as a volunteer all these years, and it has not been easy. She spent an extraordinary amount of her time and money doing this, and she really should be commended for the extraordinary work she's done on behalf of St. Jacinto. But there are some challenges that we have to deal with, and these are serious challenges. Challenge one, building a consensus on the outer boundaries of the battlefield. There really is no consensus at this point of where the battlefield outer boundaries are, and Chris McMaster is going to talk a little bit about that. Our organization has adopted the guidelines that the National Park Service uses for Civil War battlefields, and based on those guidelines, we believe that the status of the battlefield as a National Historic Landmark really should be expanded, and we are in the process of attempting to do so. Another challenge is that TPWD and the stakeholders need to be vigilant, cooperative, and proactive in monitoring and mitigating these external threats. We've got to come to grips with the fact that we cannot stop, and we don't really want to stop, the industrial expansion of the Houston Ship Channel. That's extremely important to the economy. But at the same time, we have a very limited amount of space, and it is important for conservation purposes, if we're going to preserve the site as a battlefield, that these remaining areas be preserved for posterity. A third challenge is do no additional harm to the properties that the state already has protected. And by this, it seems simple enough, but by this I'm referring to situations where there could be some efforts being made by the legislature perhaps to say, all right, well, we've got some incongruities here, we've got some conflicts, but on a going forward basis, how do we deal with future construction at the site? And one of the models that could be used is what's called Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which is a model that's applied to federal agencies. Whenever a federal agency builds anything on a historic site, they have to go through a process to take into account the effects of that construction on the historic integrity of that site. It's a process that you go through, so it's not designed to prevent construction, it's designed to identify what you're doing and, if all possible, to try to implement alternatives to prevent that destruction of that integrity, or to, if you can't do it, at least mitigate it. It seems to me that since we're now going through 2 Section 106 reviews for the battlefield right now because of federal involvement, but it seems to me like that would also apply to the state. One thing we've had recently are these structures that have popped up. There are 4 of these around the battlefield. They are electric lift stations, but they were built, one was built in the Texas Army camp, the other one was built in the San Jacinto Cemetery. One was built where Sidney Sherman charged the Mexican line on April 21st. This one was built in the area where the Mexicans were slaughtered. And it has a nice barbed wire fence around the top. And one of the things you might think about is, well, if we had had a Section 106 law in Texas, perhaps Parks and Wildlife could have built these structures in a different way or in a way that was less intrusive. So that's another challenge that I think that stakeholders and the state need to look at. Another challenge, number 4, is to rehabilitate, accurately interpret the protected properties. And by that I mean that we may have to make, or we're looking at making hard choices. What do you do about the facilities that are out there now that make it hard, if not impossible, for people to really understand what's happening? One is the picnic area where the Mexicans were slaughtered. Do you keep that as a picnic area or not? You have the reflection pool. Do you cover it up like the master plan recommended, or is that reflection pool itself historic? Battleship Texas, lots of issues with the Battleship Texas. Can it be moved? Should it be moved? If it's not moved, will the footprint be expanded? That's another issue. The Battleship parking lot on top of the Texas soldier graves. Here's the reflection pool. The reflection pool is right in the middle of where the Texas Army marched on April 21st. You also have some inaccurate representations. Here you have this representation of the Twin Sisters cannon, but there really are naval guns, and they don't really explain, there's really no explanation here of why these were here and the purpose of, and the role that they played. So these are issues that remain to be looked at. Another challenge is addressing this root cause of the Battleship Texas problem. Battleship Texas is a wonderful artifact, It is really one of our state treasures and needs to be preserved and should be preserved. The problem that is happening with it is it's deteriorating at the site, and it needs an extraordinary amount of money to fix the hull of the ship. And the proposal that has been adopted by the state of Texas is to appropriate $29 million to build a dry berth at this site, and that is to drain out the berth and build a large area where the ship can be placed. These are conceptual designs. Whether or not this will work remains to be seen, but is this really going to solve the problem for the ship? I've looked at this again for 15 years. I've followed this, and it seems to me like the real problem for the ship is money. It needs money. Because all ships need hull work. All ships need maintenance. And the ship is not getting money because it's not getting the visitors it needs at that site. The visitors are not generating the revenue. The local cities love the ship. They want the ship to stay there, but the local cities are not contributing money for the operations, maintenance, or repairs of the ship. The Battleship Texas is doing as good a job as they can, yes, to do this, but they're limited as well. So what we're looking at is that if the dry berth works, we're staring in the face about another $20 million of repairs for the ship. All of that's going to come out of state dollars, and will the state be able to afford that? This is the footprint that will change if all the facilities are constructed. And the final challenge is to look at the governance of the site, and that is that Parks and Wildlife is wonderful at recreation and natural resource conservation, but now we have other state agencies involved with historic preservation, like Texas Historical Commission, General Land Office. Why aren't those agencies involved? It seems like we ought to tap into all of the resources and expertise we can. That's it. There's great potential for this site. I could speak for another hour, and if you'd like to talk to me about it, I'd be happy to tell you about it, but that's all I have for today. Thank you very much.